All right, so we covered wastegate only, and now we got to cover the next thing, which is the reference leak or a reference bypass. And so in the last video, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch my first one. We talked about what a wastegate does and why you need to have your reference line hooked up to your wastegate. The second thing is now we're gonna do exactly what I told you not to do, and we're going to mess with that reference boost. The way that this works is, let's say that on our reference dome, or our reference volume, sorry, we've got 10 psi. And let's say that at that 10 psi in there, in the theoretical perfect world, and we don't have any back pressure issues, that the engine is actually seeing 10 psi because we don't have any drop across our intercooler. It's not going to happen. Let's just say we've got 10 psi here, but you're saying, Aaron, I want to make 15 psi. I don't want to make 10 psi. I'm going to tell you, well, you need to either lower your reference or increase your dome. And in this control method, a reference leak or a bypass, we're going to reduce the reference. So the way that this works, it oftentimes will go in line with your reference from the manifold or from your turbo preferably, and sometimes it'll come into the car. You can have a little knob, and everybody's seen it, it's just a little screw-in deal. What that does is if you leak off 5 of these PSI that you have in here, so now this is at 5 PSI, but the turbo is actually making 15 psi and you're just bleeding half of it off, well then the wastegate spring, instead of being a 10 psi spring, it effectively just became a 15 psi spring. It never ends up being 1-to-1. That's kind of the thing you got to know. Like, it can be 0.99 to 1 sometimes, but like it's never actually going to be 1-to-1. If you leak a little bit off, that's fine. The key to this, in my opinion, is to try to not leak everything off, because just like we talked about in the last video, if you just flat out unhook the reference line, you're not really controlling boost. You're controlling your boost based on back pressure, and that's not a good way to do it. If you get to that point, you need to be working off of your dome, and that's going to be picked up in the next video. Just because I don't want to like cut this one short, the way that this deal kind of works is if you've got a body and you've got sorry, I'm right-handed, you got a knob and you got an inlet and you got an outlet and then you've got a vent. Just a quick bonus, your single 3 ports are basically the same thing. It's just they're a solenoid that's actually working off of a duty cycle instead of just a screwed in valve here. So the way that this deal kind of works is internally you have a screw that's on a pintle that is changing the opening. So it changes the amount of air that goes out to your reference, and it just gets vented off to atmosphere. Basically the way that it works is with a spring and a check ball. And so the way that springs work, coil springs, the way that they work is they provide a linear increasing force over displacement. So as you screw the screw in, then the force on the spring becomes higher and it holds the check ball closed more, and you make less boost because you're venting less to atmosphere. And if you unscrew the screw, then, and don't quote me on this always, because sometimes it's screw in and sometimes it's unscrew to make more and less boost, but typically you're going to put less force on the spring and it lets the check ball open at a lower pressure, which vents more and doesn't go to your reference. You can hook the vent to the dome. Don't really recommend it. If you start getting into that stuff, it's time for a 3-port solenoid. The other thing that I'm going to throw into this video that's not good about using reference only and using wastegate only is exactly what I talked about before. Springs provide a linear increasing force. So what is this thing? This is a spring. It's got your wastegate spring is not special. It's absolutely a coil spring. And what happens is, let's say you got a 10-pound spring in there, and you start to make about 5 pounds of boost. Well, because your 10-pound spring is only a 10-pound spring at a certain displacement, then your 10-pound spring is going to start to crack at about 5 pounds of boost. Don't quote me on these numbers, this is just an example. So it starts to open a little bit, and now you got to build even more boost to overcome the fact that you're losing turbo speed because you're gating some amount of your exhaust pressure that you could otherwise be feeding through the turbo. So then by the time you get to 7 psi, now the gate's like a significant amount open, and you're struggling even more to make this boost. And what you're going to see, I'm going to do a little bit of erasing here. That's a really bad eraser. What you're going to see though over the length of a pole is your boost is going to increase a little bit at first and just slowly rise to your target. And a lot of times it'll actually kind of taper off at high RPM. And the reason that happens is your engine is consuming more at the higher RPM in terms of volume of air than the compressor is able to overcome at a given wastegate setting, because the wastegate is not seeing the pressure drop across something like an intercooler or all your piping and stuff. What we want to do is this ends up looking like a power curve that is very linear and growing, and then eventually is going to taper off. It's not the end of the world. This is sometimes okay for cars that have a lot of traction issues. The thing is like if we have a solenoid, we can make that curve. That's not a problem to make that curve. It's actually really easy to make that curve. What we wish we could do is, I'm going to grab my blue marker. This is what we want to do. This is the boost engine we wish we had. Let's make boost quick and just hold it there throughout the entire RPM range. And what that's going to do is make your power curve is going to look like an NA power curve. It's going to be at twice the amount of power that you would have made NA if you make 14.5 pounds boost. So it's going to look like a nice typical power curve. And ultimately, if you can get it hooked up, the car's going to go faster with the blue curve, right? Because we're putting more tractive force into the track or into the street or into wherever you're running this thing. You can do it on the moon if you want to, but we're putting more tractive force down at a lower RPM sooner and for longer. Therefore, the car's going to go faster. All right, that's it for the reference leak bypass. I'm going to go ahead. Oh, don't want to use blue. Check that one off. All right, GSP out.